All right. So, topics for discussion today. We're going to go over a few different, just short mini topics, mainly around making your apps more user friendly and just making them work better. Um, so that's where we're getting into today. So we're going to talk about how to use cards. We'll talk about snack bars. We're going to talk about transitions. And also briefly in there, I want to mention something called swipe to refresh. So that's kind of the broad scale of what we're going to talk about in terms of those things. So the first topic, the first thing we want to look at is cards. And you may remember seeing and using cards with Bootstrap last semester. We did that quite a bit. And basically, anytime we had a list of things we needed to show, I said, well, you should put that in cards. And it's the same idea on Android. So basically, anytime you have a recycler view, more than likely, it's not necessarily hard and fast, but more than likely, everything in that recycler view should be a card. In general, things that are outside of a recycler view should probably not be cards. It's generally only things that are inside of a recycler view. So that's what we're talking about. Is basically styling those items within the recycler view. It gives us a few things. It's going to give us a few sort of appearance, sort of behaviors, making the cards look like they're things, making them look like they're cards. It's also going to give us some gestures that we can implement, namely like you can swipe left or swipe right to do a gesture with the card, or you can kind of long press it and drag it up and down to reorder the cards. So both of those functionalities, both of those gestures, we also get by using cards. And those, again, kind of make the most sense when you have it in a recycler view. So let's talk a little bit about cards here in terms of looking over the material design guidelines. I just put a link to the page I'm looking at here in Discord, so you can look at it on your own if you want to kind of go through there. So it gives a kind of summary of, what are these cards and how should they look. And the simple, just basic card here we have, hey, it's got a border. You've got a kind of card title, some secondary text, but you can see that this is almost looks like it's elevated. So part of the theory of material design is that things should look like they're physical objects as much as possible. That's part of the kind of the motivation behind material design, is things should behave like physical materials, and that means things like it should cast shadows if it's above the regular elevation of the screen. So that's where you're seeing a little shadow down on the bottom. You can also see in here, in this demo, we can kind of add some additional pieces. So let's say we want to add an image. Okay, well, so we can put the media in there. We can add some more supporting text that might appear there. And then maybe we have some buttons that we also want to add to the bottom of the card. So cards are really flexible. Actually, a lot of this stuff, as far as what actually goes into the card, is very much a design preference. Basically, you can put any layout you want inside of this card. You're not constrained to just what they've recommended. But it's good to follow those recommendations because users have a certain expectation about how things are going to operate. So working within those expectations is generally a good thing. Okay. So these are very flexible, but at the same time, we do want to kind of correspond to what the user is expecting. So there's a few kind of core principle thinking about cards. Cards should be contained, namely that a card is kind of identifiable as a single contained unit, like a thing. So if you're thinking about like products are things. If you're thinking about your items within your shopping cart, those are things. If you're talking about people or your friends list, or maybe it's a bunch of posts or comments, all of those can be thought of as things, and so they should be maybe as cards. Okay, so basically a card should be a contained single thing. Other thing worth noting, cards should never contain other cards. If you've got one card, you should never put a card inside of it. If you need to have additional information or things inside of it, you probably need to put that on another screen where they say click on the card, and then that takes them to the other screen where they can see the other pieces. It's also, cards should also be independent, so they're not connected to any of the surrounding context. They're an independent chunk. And they should be individual. So, for instance, you can't merge two cards together. You don't want to do that, or you shouldn't divide a thing into multiple cards, right? Every card should represent a thing. So in terms of looking at the card anatomy, here's kind of the expected anatomy for how you build out your cards. So you see number one. Number one is your large container. That's the whole thing. Number two is if you have a thumbnail. Thumbnail's optional. You probably want to put it up here. If you have a title, that would go here. Secondary text, like a subheader, that would go directly underneath. If you have a media, whether it be image or video or audio, that kind of media should generally go here in the middle. And then if you have text underneath, such as like a short description would go underneath that image. And then, if you have some actions, the actions should always be at the bottom. There are occasions where sometimes you can put an action in the top right corner, but generally your action should be in the bottom left. And you'll notice that they don't use any regular buttons for this. They're either strictly icons, right? So you have icons that might appear in the bottom right, or you have text buttons that appear in the bottom left. They don't use the regular buttons for this context. Okay.
Hey, Mr. Smith, a quick question. How would you differentiate Bootstrap cards from these cards? How can we think of them differently?
No, it's the same idea. Material design just has this is how we want you to make cards. Does that make sense? Okay. But they're the same conceptual idea. If you kind of, Bootstrap, you've got your header, you may have an image in there, and you might have some stuff on the bottom that's part of the body. It's the same kind of idea. The difference is that whereas the cards in Bootstrap, because they're, we were using them in a desktop context, we weren't dealing with gestures. So we weren't dealing with like swipe or dragging or moving gestures. That is something that you have to deal with cards in the Android world. Is to be able to support gestures on those cards, okay? Because you're talking about touchscreens. So that's the gestures part is what really makes them different. So if you're kind of looking further into the anatomy, you can lay that out. Sometimes you may want to put the image on top to make it more prominent. It can either go here in the middle as they have it, or it could go on the top. So you've got kind of your rich media section, you've got your title, you got potentially supporting text, and you've got actions. Now, as we've kind of said, a lot of these things are optional. You generally should have, you have a container, and you're generally going to have some text or an image, but a lot of these pieces may or may not make sense for the specific thing or the specific case that you're building. Okay. Dividers, you may also want to have those in if you have separated areas. One thing you'll notice about how they do dividers, these are inset, so they don't go all the way to the edge. So there's like a 8 or 16 dp of padding or margin between the edge and here. Here's a more complex example of a card where they have it expand and collapse at the bottom. So you can see on the regular side, you got a short card, you hit expand, and then you can see the full 7-day forecast. So that's a common thing you might see if you need to put a lot of data onto a card. And with this, if they're expanding, they make the divider go the full width versus it only goes part of the width here. Other important things are transitions when you're working with cards. So for instance here they're kind of clicking on the card and it expands into a full screen to kind of edit their contact. So they have a list of contacts which expands into another activity basically to edit that contact. Other things that you can see, sometimes there may be an expand and collapse button like this. You can expand it and see additional information. That's a common sort of pattern. So they say, use this, don't do this. Generally don't do a flip to see other information that's recommended against. Elevation wise, as you saw, cards kind of have a shadow that comes with them. And so typically you're going to see about a 1 dp shadow by default. When you actually go pick up a card and start dragging it around, it actually goes to a higher elevation. So you can see the default elevation here is 8 once you've picked it up. And so that gives a more of a highlight, the fact that, hey, you're dragging it now. Plus, so you're expecting it to appear above other things. Also, you can see swipe gestures. Oftentimes here, you might use a left or right swipe to dismiss the card is probably I would say that's the most common. Sometimes you'll also do like a left or right swipe like this, which will reveal maybe additional option that you can do. And so some apps will have one action if you swipe it right. Other apps might have a different action if you swipe left. But that's kind of the way that gesture operates. Things you do want to be careful of is avoiding having a different gesture from one place in the card to another. Wherever you are in the card, it should have the same gesture. So here they're trying to put a gallery and the swipe favorite gesture into the same place. Realistically, this should just be a swipe right, as here, where you can favorite it that way. And then you should click on the card. The next screen should be the one where you see the gallery, so that there's not a conflict of, if you swipe on this part of the card, it does one thing, and if you swipe on another part of the card, it does something else. You don't want that. Pick up and move gestures, as you see here, they're kind of picking up long pressing the blue card and picking it up and dragging it somewhere else. And you can see the other cards kind of rearrange as that happens. So that's a common thing that we can do with cards, is move them around. And so the other cards will then move around with them. Things you don't want to do as that happens, you want to make sure that the cards are actually at a higher elevation. They don't appear behind. This happens if you use the functionality out of the box. The behavior that you want here. This tends to happen if you're trying to implement this yourself. Other things you don't want to do is, as you're moving the cards, here they kind of move it and the other ones bump or move out of the way. Instead, it should just kind of jump like the other one does. So cards have a lot of gesture stuff that comes with them. As I said, that's kind of the new part that makes them different from, say, Bootstrap. Is all the gesture work. So things you may want to do if you have a lot of information here. So here they have a list of like restaurants, and so you can click to see all the reviews. So you can expand like that. That's considered good practice. To just click and expand and make that taller. What is recommended you don't do is don't do this. So here they're clicking and expand. But then there's a scroll view, right? So there's another scroll view for the comments. The problem is that creates two different scroll areas, where are you scrolling the comments or are you scrolling the whole screen? And so you don't want to do that. You want to stick with this, where scrolling is still scrolling up and down the screen. That's a big thing that you have to watch out for, is that the overlap of gestures, where you want to be careful about up and down gestures. Really need to have one expected behavior, and left and right gestures, left and right swipes, need to have a single defined behavior. Also worth noting in terms of actions, the primary action for a card should always be the entire card. Should always be the entire card. That's in the guidelines. We've kind of talked about this already, but you see how they say the action area, this is the entire thing. The expectation is not that you click on just the image and that activates, or just the text and that activates. The action area should be the entire thing. Okay? Everybody clear on that? So that's per the material guidelines, and this is where it is. That is like the defined how your app should behave on Android. Is you don't want to say, hey, I just click on the image and it goes to the next screen. It should be click anywhere on the item and it goes to the next screen, kind of thing. If you do have supplemental actions, so in case they have buttons here, so they have some text buttons and some icons. Generally, they recommend not doing both. Keep it either to icons or text, but those would appear at the bottom of the screen, which would mean then you kind of got two action areas. So all of this would activate your behavior, and then this action area down here would activate the other behavior. So that way, it's really constrained to where those additional actions are. They're just on the bottom of the card. Sometimes if you have an additional settings, things that don't fit, you can put an overload menu in the top corner or the bottom corner. That's okay. But general recommendation is to limit the number of actions that you have always visible on the card to 2. So either two text buttons or 2 icons. Having more than that you really need to have probably should be on the next screen, or put it in an overflow menu as they've done here. In terms of having different UI controls, such as things that do different operations. So for instance, here they have a 5-star rating. You'll notice that they're putting that on the bottom of the card, so that it's in that kind of secondary action area. They're not putting it in the middle or otherwhere or on the top. They're putting it on the bottom to keep with those conventions. Also things here, hey, they've got a slider that's operating to change things. That's okay. They do mention, be careful about what you put on a card. You don't want to put too much information here. Here you've got a lot of different pieces of text. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pieces of text. That's really generally too much. So you do want to kind of limit that. Focus is something you also have to pay attention to. So as you're going through with the focus, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to keyboard access as well as D-pad if they're using it. So you see the focus kind of starts as the card as a whole, and then proceeds on down through each of the actions, and then goes on to the next card, goes on down. That's how the order of the focus should be. Card collections, you can kind of see how they've got them grouped together. So this one would be in that kind of masonry sort of style. This is a staggered grid, because they're not exactly aligned, all being the same height. Different things they suggest. They suggest that cards should generally be scannable, so you can quickly kind of go through them and find the information that you're looking for. That is pretty important, is to be able to scan through them pretty quickly. Sometimes this gets used for dashboard type things. So here they've got them kind of arranged where they're all different sizes and shapes. That's okay if you're trying to build a dashboard. Let's see. Sometimes you may have cases like this where they've got actually a recycler view here that's going left and right instead of up and down. So they're using that to, they're swiping through those different birds here, left and right. That's fine. One of the things you don't want to do is what's happening here, where this top part, you see how there's that ripple animation when they press there. That's because this whole top part, they made a card, right? So it's important to recognize that a card should represent an item, such as each of these birds. You have to be very careful about where you use it, because if you use it in the wrong place, then you get some behavior like this, where you're pressing and seeing a ripple animation where you really probably shouldn't, because it's not a thing, it's just the header. If you do, as you do add lists and those lists grow large, oftentimes you'll need to add sorting and filtering. The recommended place to add that is up here at the top, outside of the recycler view. So here we're saying, we've got images, you can sort by date, you might be able to sort by name, there'd be different things from that drop down. If you, for instance, then also needed a filter, so say I only want small images or large images, or only want PNGs or only JPEGs or GIFs, then I might add that as, you'd add that as another drop down here. So you might have a drop down for filter, you might have a drop down for sort, but they need to be up there and outside of that. As had been maybe mentioned previously, there is an owl material example that you can look at to see how they've done some of these things. That example application you can pull down and actually play around with. Let me kind of pull up the link here. So this is a general good guideline to kind of see how they recommend you do a few different things in terms of the material design, the theming, as well as using a lot of these components. So that can be a very helpful example to look at. Now that we've kind of looked and talked about some of the theory of cards, we can go back up to the top and kind of go to the implementation tab here. So under the implementation tab, it'll give you some of the code that you need to make this happen. Now you'll notice that there's a drop down. For me, it's already pre-selected as Android. If it hasn't pre-selected as Android, you may need to switch it over. So interesting things to note there. There actually is a version of Material Design, for instance, that you can actually use on the web. We were using Bootstrap instead, but they do provide some packages and some tools where you can use Material Design in web as a replacement or as an alternative to Bootstrap. They do have a web version as well. But for Android, this is what we're looking at. So going down, unfortunately, the most important stuff is not really up at the top. So I'm going to go all the way down to card. And so here's kind of the way that you kind of expect a card to look, as we've talked about. The component that you'll need to use, like the base styling, comes from widget.materialcomponents.cardView. And the actual component that we're going to end up using is the material card view. That's the actual view that we add to our layouts. So if we scroll down a little bit, here's kind of an example card, right? So this is what it looks like, and here's the code that goes with it. So you'll notice the outer tag, right? The outer tag is a material card view, right? So if you're making your item layout and you want to put them in the cards, the outer layout there needs to be of type material card view. Is everybody with me here? What do we normally have at the root of our layouts that we've done so far?
It's app compat.
I'm looking for the specific view. What's usually at the root? Let's say you start a brand new layout. What's at the root?
It's like starts with the C. Constraint layout view, is it?
Constraint layout. So usually constraint layout is going to be at the top, right? Which is kind of a gotcha, because you'll notice how this is architected. You have the card, and then inside of that you have a layout. So in this case, they're doing it with linear layout. But you could easily enough do this with constraint layout, which is what I would recommend. But that requires a little bit of finagling. And in reality, I'll kind of show you how I've set this up with the Droid Cafe project. But I have not found a way really within the designer to set this up that really works the way it needs to. So what I've had to do in order to get these cards in is I've actually had to go manually change the code and put this stuff in. Okay. Wrap the card around the layout. Is everybody with me there?
Not yet.
Okay. So to change the layout, right, I had to move things around in the code. So let's look at this. Let's kind of jump into the example app that we're going to look at today, and look at how this operates. So I've got kind of I've built onto the Droid Cafe project. I've added a few things, and we'll kind of walk through those things today. I'm not doing a code along today. I'm just going to do a code walkthrough to keep this kind of brief and moving forward. I will give you all of the code for this example at the end of class today. All right?
Yep.
So you'll have all this code. So first things first, up on the main screen, things that are new, you can see that there is each of these items, each of your products is in a card. May or may not be, the outline is maybe not obvious, but you'll notice as I tap one and drag, you'll kind of see what we call that ripple animation as I'm moving things up and down. Okay, so those cards are appearing there. If I then tap on one of those, you'll see that ripple animation going, and you'll see there's also a transition happening there. You know, I can go back and play that again. You'll notice as it goes from one screen to another, that the components, namely like the name, the description, the image, and the price, those kind of all animate and transition to the place where they are on the next screen. So that animation that you're seeing is what we call a shared element transition. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about how to do today. Okay. So that's a common thing that comes up with, especially when you start to deal with cards and things like this. Those things go really well together. So we've got our card. We can click anywhere on it, and we get that ripple animation, and it'll pull it over here. Next thing, I'm going to go over to the add cart screen, and you'll notice on the cart, I've also converted these over to cards, right? So you've got a card there. I can go add some more things to the cart, maybe add some froyo, maybe add a donut, right? So you're seeing cards both on the main screen as well as here in the shopping cart, you know, because both of those are cases where we're seeing a list of things. Both of those include a recycler view. Okay, now there are some differences there, namely on the first screen when we're looking at the list of products, right? Conceptually, where would that be coming from? Well, that would be coming from a database somewhere. So that data on that first screen is really coming generally from outside of the app, and is really not in the control of the user. The user wouldn't have the ability to, say, edit a product. More than likely, but they should have the ability to edit their cart, right? So oftentimes you'll get into this division where there is oftentimes some information that is outside of the user's control, that is owned by you and you're controlling it, and you may have oftentimes the way that you edit that data may actually be on the website and may not actually be in the app. Versus here you have data that is owned by the user, and therefore different rules apply. Does that make sense? So in whatever app you're building as your project, I would expect to see some of both. I would expect to see some data that is, you know, as you're kind of working through it, I would expect some data that's going to be basically outside of your control that's going to be hosted in a central data store where everybody can see it. And there's probably also going to be some data that the user has the ability to edit that would then be inside of the app where they would manage that data. So what you do with those two kind of things is going to be a little bit different. Now, on the screen on the shopping cart, a common thing that you might want to do with your shopping cart is to maybe remove things from the cart. And the way that we've done that previously is we added a delete button, right? And that can work, but that's usually not what users expect in terms of being able to add in terms of being able to remove things from a list. So what I've added in here is I can swipe right, I can swipe the froyo off screen. There, it's been removed from the cart. Did everybody see that? So you can use a left or a right swipe. I'm going to swipe left here and it's gone as well. So that's a common thing that you may want to do with the cards, is to be able to swipe them left or swipe them right to remove them from a list. The other thing I can do, let me go and add things back onto this list. The other thing I may want to do, if I have an order, if I have a list like this, I may want to be able to reorganize them, change the order of the items in that list. So, for instance, let's say you're making a tier list of the best characters in Smash Brothers. Well, you may want to drag things up and down. Or if you have a favorites list, well, maybe you need to reorganize that somehow. So the way this is set up, I can hold and do a long press. It will then be up here where I can float it. I can maybe drag it down like that. So I can actually rearrange my list, my shopping cart, by using gestures here. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
So those are the swipe gestures for left and right, and that moving for dragging it around and rearranging it. Both of those things you get by having cards. You don't get that functionality if you don't introduce cards into your recycler view. Okay, so that's one of the things that's kind of a dependency to make that work. And that's one of the reasons that you want to have cards in your recycler views, not just for the display reasons, but for the purpose of those gestures. So that's kind of where those things fit in. Now let's talk about how I implement those cards, and then we'll talk about how we do the gestures as well. So I'm going to go into the layout folder, and the two layouts that changed were item cart and item product. To do these, as cards, you don't have to change any of the other layouts. It's just the item layout. And it's pretty easy change. I've gone ahead and I've kind of redid and moved some things around in the design of the cards. But typically all you've got to do is take your layout that you already have and wrap it in a card. So I'm going to look at the code here, right? And let me resize this down a little bit so we can see this nice and big. So what I've got here up at the top, you'll see that the first tag, right, is material card view, right? The first tag is material card view. My next tag is constraint layout. Everybody see that? So the entire constraint layout is inside of the card.
You just wrapped it. That's all it was.
That's all I did. So I took the layout that we already had and I wrapped it up in a card. Now, there is one gotcha, namely that if you just start wrapping it up and wrap a material card view around it, you're going to see something like this, where these XML namespaces, right, they're typically defined, they've got to be defined at the root. So when you've done this here, you'll see that the XML namespace is defined on the constraint layout. It's not defined on the material card view, at least initially. But you'll see how this turns red, right? So it can't find the Android namespace because you haven't defined it until down here. Everybody see that? So all of those things that you see at the beginning, Android : or if you see app : tools : that's all defined by those three properties. And so you need to make sure as you're wrapping it, as you're moving things around, these properties need to be on the root. They need to be on the root. And in fact, you also see the highlight here. It says namespace declaration is redundant. They should only ever be declared once. So you will have to manually move those from the constraint layout to the material card view.
Does it break if you don't move them and it's duplicated?
It will most likely not work. If it's duplicated, it might work. If it's only down here and not there, it won't work at all. But I would strongly suggest that you have it just on the one or the two. So that needs to be at the root of whatever XML resource you have, and that's just by virtue of it being XML. That's an XML requirement. That's not an Android requirement. In terms of the XML language. Okay. So there's no need about there. Other things to note, you'll see what I've set the width and the height to. I've set the width of the card to match parent. The height of it is wrap content. That's on the card view as well as the constraint layout. It needs to be exactly those two values. You can't use anything else, is what I found from playing around with it.
I love it. I love it when there's no variation.
So match parent, wrap content. That's all it is. Other things to note in here, you'll need to add this because you won't have it already, is you'll need to set a margin of 8 dp on the card. That keeps the card from going up all the way to the edge. I think you could do 16 dp as well. You just don't want to leave it as the default of 0. So here I can bump it up to 16. I think that still works. But if I had it at the 0, we can actually go back to 8. So that's how I did the cart item. Same thing with the item product. If we look at the, that did not do what I wanted. Let's scale that down much further. So with items in the product items, same kind of thing where you have a card view around it and a constraint layout inside. So any item layouts that you have, all of the recycler views in your app, you'll want to make this change where you wrap the layout inside of a material card view. That's really all you need to know there in terms of adding the card to the layout. Okay. So that part's pretty easy. And this constraint layout can be anything. As long as you set the width and height to match parent and wrap content, you can have anything you want inside of that layout. So you saw the standards of kind of like, oh, your layout should generally be this way or that way. I mean, really, it's a constraint layout. You can design it any way you want to. Cool. Any questions on the layout here? How to set that up? Okay. So let's talk about the gestures. So on the home screen, there are no gestures. I can't swipe to the right, or I can't do any sort of rearranging because that data, well, it's not owned by me. So it wouldn't make sense for me to do any gestures on that first screen. Does that make sense? So you're usually going to have that division of here's data that's mine and here's data that's not mine. So in this case where this is data that's not mine, I'm not going to implement those gestures. So some screens may have that support, some screens may not. So in here, I don't have any swipe left or swipe down, reordering ability, but you will notice that if I swipe down, I've got kind of this refresh icon that appears. Everybody see that on my screen? So that's what we call swipe to refresh. So you can pull that down. That's a common kind of idiom to be able to refresh the data. So typically that would do things like go to the server, download the data again. So for instance, if you're having some sort of news reader or you're reading articles, you might want to put that in so that the user can go we'll see what the newest article says. Get the data in sync. So we'll talk about that gesture. So that's the only gesture though that's on this first screen. So going back to this screen, you remember that there's a swipe as well as a move gesture. The code for that is over here in card activity. So inside of card activity, the magic class that you need to know about is this class called item touch helper. And I will say that this code is convoluted. The upside is that it basically does a lot of the grunt work for you. So there's not a lot of difficult coding to write. But I will say that this is very hard to write from memory. I don't know how I would remember how to write all of this stuff other than looking at a code example, to be fair. So that's the note here. So we're going to use this item touch helper, and basically the first thing you have to do is construct one. Now, as it turns out, the item touch helper is extra complicated. So rather than actually building an item touch helper, we built a simple version of that. So to the constructor of item touch helper, we pass a new item touch helper simple callback object. So this is where we're actually going to put most of our code. But we're passing that to the constructor of item touch helper. So we're actually constructing two objects, as you can see. One here, one here. This one is just a regular object, just a regular constructor. This one, as you're seeing here, is an anonymous class, which we've seen a few times before with listeners and such.
I got a question. Is this your code? Like, this is what you come up with, or is this kind of like the standard way of doing it? And, you're like constructing an object within an object.
This code is almost identical to a code example I found online.
Okay. All right.
Ironically, the place I found this online, I have not found this anywhere in Google's own documentation. I found this in the code lab for 5.2. But
okay.
They do, if I look on Android developers, there is actually no guide for this as far as I can tell, which is very odd. But they do have this is in the 5.2 code lab, but I was not able to find this otherwise. And I think there was one Stack Overflow answer about it as well. So it's not very well documented. I was really, really surprised. So inside here, the first thing we have to pass to this constructor, it just takes two arguments. The first one is, as you can see, is the drag directions. So those are the directions that you're able to drag the card in. So as you see here, I've said left, right, up, and down. And so that means I can hold. You initiate the drag by doing a long press, and then I can push it in any of the four directions. So because I've given it all four of those. If I said, well, it can only be dragged up and down, you run that again, we're going to see a little bit of a different behavior. So if I say I want to only be able to drag it up and down, you'll see there I can drag it up and down, but I can no longer drag it left and right. Now, it's worth noting, remember that there's a grid layout for use with the recycler view. If you're really going to support that grid layout, you do need the drag to be in all four directions. If it's just a vertical like this one where everything's in one column, it's okay to do the drag as just up and down. That's fine. But you don't want to do that if you're on a grid, because that would prevent you from moving it left and right as you need to. Now let's check one thing. What happens if I say, well, these cards can only be dragged up, and that is the only option. So if I add maybe two things to the cart, if I try to hold and drag this, you'll see I can move it up. I can't move it down. Here I can move this up. but I can't move it. Move it up, but I can't move it down. So generally speaking, whatever direction you pick should always be paired. You should always be able to, if you can move it up, you should be able to move it down. If you move it left, you should be able to move it right. So I would generally keep those drag values paired up, left, right, up, down. Okay. Other thing worth noting in here. So I'm specifying all of these for values. Each of those is a constant. Left, right, up, and down is a constant. If I look at their definitions, we'll find that each of those is an integer. Okay, so up is 1, down is this thing, which actually turns out to be 2, left is 4, right is 8. So there's an interesting thing happen here, which you may or may not have seen before. Okay. You may or may not have seen before that. So notice this is, I'm saying this is 1, 2, 4, and 8. That's important because those are powers of 2. Okay? Those are powers of 2. So remember, numbers in your computer are stored in binary. They're stored as a sequence of zeros and ones, right? And binary also means that they're stored in base 2. Which makes this idea of powers of 2 extra important. So if I were to represent this drag direction, basically what I'm building out is I'm building out a 4-bit string, a 4-bit number. So the first bit being whether or not it can be dragged in one direction, second bit representing whether or not it can be dragged in the second, third, and fourth. So effectively, in this number, I've got 4 Boolean flags. Is everybody with me there? It can be either 0 or 1. That's what I'm trying to build up. So this first bit in here, that represents 1 because it's, again, base 2. Second bit is 2. Third bit here would be 4. And the fourth bit is, well, 8. So if I look at the code here, I can see that up is the first bit, down is the second bit, left is the third bit, and right is the fourth bit. So each of those 4 bits represents those different directions.
I see the 2 left brackets there. I've never seen that notation. I've seen it where it's the what's on the 6 key. I've seen that for powers.
Okay, this is not powers. This is not powers. This is what we call a bit shift. This is a bit shift.
Okay, and it's always 2. 2 to the first power, 2 to the second power, like this.
Powers and bit shift are not exactly the same. The way this works out, this is essentially raising it to, 2 to the first power, 2 to the second, 2 to the third, is how it works out. You can only do this shifting as powers as long as it's base 2. There's no way to do this if it's any other base. So the way this works is a bit shift says take the number and shift it 1 to the left. So like you can see this is 1 shifted 1 digit to the left, 1 shifted 2 digits to the left, 1 shifted 3 digits to the left. So if I start with 1, remember these are 4-bit flags that I'm dealing with. So the first one is 1. If I take if I take 1 and I shift it over 1 bit to the left, I get the number 0010. If I shift it again, I get 00100. Shift it the third time, I get that.
Yeah, so 1,000, if you will, that's 16.
Yeah, no, that's 8. That's 8. 1, 2, 4, 8.
Oh, okay, I got it.
So we've got, up is 1, which is this. Down is, down is 2. And left is 8. And so right, That's 4 is 8. Right? So basically I'm combining those bits together, and so every bit that's set to 1 indicates that it can be slid in that direction. Right? So I can specify any combination of those that I want. Okay? So this technique, what we're doing here, we call this a bit mask. A bit mask, saying that, you know, this bit represents a particular thing. It's a lot of bit twiddling, we're also referred to it as. So you'll notice here that there's a single bar for OR. Remember that we typically use 2 bars when we're writing an OR statement or expression. And remember that 2 bars is what we call a logical OR. We use the 2 bars when we're working with Booleans. This single bar is actually meant, as we're using here, for integers. It's working with integers and binary types of calculation. Everybody with me?
You only need 1 if you're using binary or integers.
It's not that you need 1, you have to use exactly 1. If I put 2 here, that actually converts the whole thing from an integer to a Boolean, which this needs to be an integer. Does that make sense?
Okay.
It breaks because the double OR implicitly has a conversion to Boolean. The single OR, the single bar, does not convert it to a Boolean. It keeps it as an integer. So for instance here, if I say, we've defined those numbers up there. If I have, for instance, this 001, right? That's the first bit and the last bit set. So this would be up or right. Does that make sense? 1001 is a combination of the first bit being set and the bottom one. So that would say that. If I wanted to say up and down would be 0011. That would be up and down.
Could you hard code those if you wanted to? I know it wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah,
but you
could. Like technically, what I have here, if I have all of those bits set, right? So technically the value I'm passing is up, down, left, right.
There's an integer that stands for whatever that might be.
15. That's 15. Because 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1 comes out to be 15. So I could actually directly put here this number 15. It's the same thing, but it's not readable because now what does that 15 represent?
Yeah, you'd have to know what it means ahead of time.
Yeah. So that is a complicated calculation just to get to the number 15. But that is how we use that, and that's actually a very common technique because it provides a lot of. It's actually a very performance helpful thing. This is a very efficient thing to do an OR, and it gives you a way to pass all of these 4 different booleans without having 4 different inputs. So it's a very commonly used thing, and this is not the only place in Android where that happens. Okay, so that's what I'm saying, is it can be any of those 4 directions, and I'm using the single OR to combine those bit flags. If I wanted to say it can't be dragged in any direction, well, I put the number 0 there, right? Because that would be all of the flags turned off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it would be like having nothing.
Yeah. So if I put 0, that would completely disable all of the dragging. Here you'll notice that I'm saying, well, it can be swiped left or right. If I were to just change that to 0, then I could no longer swipe left or right to move it to the card, move it out of the card. So here, if I try to swipe left or right, nothing happens. Or I could say, well, I just want something to happen when you swipe left and not when you swipe right. So I could put that as just item touch left, touch helper left. And that would mean that I can swipe left but not right. So here I can swipe left to remove it, but I can't swipe it to the right. But I would say it's generally a better UX if you can give the user the experience, the ability to swipe left or right, because then you handle both left-handed as well as right-handed people with equal kind of expectations. So some people may have the expectation that they can swipe it right. Some people may have the expectation that they can swipe it left to dismiss. If you just give them the option to do either one, that's the most accessible option. Okay. Any questions on that so far? On that question, on that now? Does that make sense? What all those constants are there?
Yeah, it's pretty easy.
So in terms of implementing the simple callback, there are two methods you have to implement. One is on move and the other one is on swiped. So on move is what happens when you drag things. It's what's happening when I long press and drag things up and down, versus the on swiped is what's happening when I swipe left or right. So I have two different handlers basically for those different gestures. So if I swipe left and right, what I get is on swiped gets two things. It gets the view holder that it's involved, and it gets the direction that it's being swiped in. So you'd say, do this if you're swiping left, do another thing if you're swiping right, using that direction. The view holder gives you a way to get back to the particular item that's in question. So it doesn't give you the object or the item directly, it gives you the view holder. What you can then do with that, and you can say viewholder.getAdapterPosition. GetAdapterPosition will return the index in the list that is bound to. So I'm going to say getAdapterPosition, so that will give me like 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And then I can say, okay, well, give me the item in the cart with that index. And then I'm saying, well, let's remove that item. So I'm initiating a remove on whatever item you swipe left or right. So does that make sense as far as what I'm doing there to remove an item from the cart? You just get the item and then you run your logic based on that. But the important thing there is viewholder.getAdapterPosition. That's really the magic part of making that work. In terms of the on move, that gets triggered as you drag things up and down. And so that receives a few different parameters. One is the recycler view in question. Typically, you don't actually need to do anything with this first argument. I don't know why it's passed, because generally you don't need it. The second argument is where is it starting from? Where's the drag originated? And the third argument here is where are you dropping it, right? So I'm dragging it from one position to another. And just like I did with the case of swiping, you want to call getAdapterPosition to find out which index in the list is that. So I can say, give me the position where it's coming from, give me the position where it's going to, and then I'm going to initiate the swap, initiate the change in the actual data. So here I'm saying cart.swap, and I'm swapping those two positions. So whatever's at position A goes to position B, and vice versa. So I swap those two, and then you've got to tell the adapter that you have to tell the adapter that the order changed. So not only do I have to change it in the data, I also have to tell the adapter specifically notify item moved. Now it's worth noting here, if you do have to use specifically that method. If you were to do instead adapter dot notify dataset changed, which is one of those methods that we've done before. Oh, I misspelled it. That's why. Adapter dot notify dataset changed. If I call that method instead, there's actually a bug that occurs with that. So I'm going to add 2 items to my cart. And so if I call notify dataset changed, when I drag up, it actually, you notice how it's no longer dragging. So notify dataset change actually aborts the gesture. It stops the gesture, which is why you have to make sure that you have to call notify item moved instead to tell it that it's moved. Not all the data's changed, just something's moved from position A to position B. Otherwise, you get that weird behavior where I drag it up, and then I can stop. It stops letting me continue doing the drag, which is very not user-friendly, suffice to say. Another thing I noticed, and this is actually counter to the code examples that I saw, is I had to return false here. I may have missed something. All the code examples that I saw, they said return true. In fact, Google's own thing that I found said return true, but for me it did not work if I returned true. It only worked for me if I said return false. So that's the kind of gist of the pattern, is you swap the data, you notify the adapter that there's been a change, and then you return false. Now, with the swap, let me just show you how I've got this method implemented. It's fairly simple. It's in the cart class, and I'm just using collections.swap. And so that just swaps the two positions. You know, takes what's in from, puts it in to, what's in to goes to from. So I'm just using a utility method to swap the 2 items in the list. Okay?
Mr. Smith?
Yep.
How hard would it be now to put like a trash can at the bottom of the page, and so if they drag the item to the trash can, it deletes it from their cart?
There might be a way to do that. I would say don't do that because it's more than likely not what the user's expecting. I'm sure there's a way to do it. I don't think that's out of the box, and I don't think that you could do it this way. I don't think Item Touch Helper would help you with that. I think you would actually have to get a little bit more low level to do that, because you'd be dragging something from, if you had a trash can, well, that would not be an item in the list, correct?
Yeah.
Right? It'd have to be like a separate button more than likely, so I'd be taking it and dragging it. And you see what happens if I tried to drag it out of here. It can't leave the recycler view. So this Item Touch Helper does not support dragging things out of the recycler view. That's a more complicated thing. Cool. But the general expectation is that you usually use the swipe. If you're going to do a delete, that should be a swipe left or a swipe right. That's what I expect you to do. Cool. And that means we could actually remove the delete button there. Any questions on cards or gestures therein?
No, I just have to try it out.
Okay. So there's really not too much code to it, you know, and you can see the code I've got into it. There's really not too much going on. But it is code that basically you're going to have to just kind of like, here it is. This is what you do. Anyway, the next topic to cover is to talk real quickly about Snackbars. So you may notice if I change the quantity here, you see this pop-up that shows up. It says quantity updated. That is what we call a snack bar. And so a snack bar is really just an improved version of a toast. That's what you can think about it. A snack bar is a replacement for toast messages. Toast messages were really only ever meant to be largely used as a debugging tool. Realistically, you should remove all of your toasts once you go to actually put this in your user's hands, because the toasts in large part are not very user-friendly, and they don't look very professional either. So I generally recommend, you actually pull all of your toasts out once you're done kind of doing your debugging, and the ones that still need to say, well, those you convert to snack bars. Does that make sense? So a snack bar gives you a way to kind of quickly say, here's something that happened, right? So I can pop up a snack bar to say, hey, we updated the quantity and all of those numbers are different. Or I've got a snack bar that appears, it says removed from cart. Similarly, if I add something to the cart, I've got a message that appears up here, added to cart. So there's a few downsides. Part of the reason you don't want to use the toast is, first of all, they're not themable. You can't change the color of a toast. It's always that semi-transparent white with black text. And you can't change anything about how a toast looks. On the other hand, a snack bar, you can completely retheme it to your heart's content. You can make it look as whatever makes sense for your application. It's fully controlled by theming. You could also control the position where it appears. So if I just had a toast, it would always just appear here. I don't have any option of where it appears. It appears always to the bottom of the screen, kind of centered. Versus you can see that toast message, I'm actually changing where it appears. Namely, I'm making sure it appears above this divider. So that is really helpful in terms of having a UI that looks good. The other places where I put this snack bar in here is I've actually implemented some validation finally on the order screen. So for instance, if I don't fill in my name, you can see that this message appears. Please enter your name. And in fact, if the keyboard's up, it appears above the keyboard, which is great, rather than appearing here in the middle of the keyboard. So that's basically where snack bars fit in. They're a better version of your toasts and themable, positionable. One of the differences, though, whereas toasts, they basically appear outside of your app. They're not constrained to your application. One of the things that means is if you show a toast on one screen, or from one activity, or from the background, it will appear on top of the screen on another screen. Or if you're, sometimes you can have, if you have a background application that shows a toast, that toast might actually appear while you're using a completely another app. That's one of the problems with toasts, is the user doesn't really know which app fired or showed the toast, because it could be triggered from the back end. Whereas a snack bar is constrained to the bounds of your activity. So it's inside the activity instead of being outside the activity. Okay? Everybody clear here? Questions?
Yes.
Okay. So, basically it's a replacement for your toasts. The way that you make a snack bar appear is actually very easy. So you'll remember with a toast that we're going to say hey, we want to, we're going to say toast dot make text, and then we would say dot show. Well, this is the way you show a snack bar. It's almost identical. So I start with snack bar instead of toast, and I'm going to call make, and I have to then provide it sort of a view to a view that's in the screen, which will help determine where it appears. So for instance, here I'm saying link it to the items view. I need to give it a string or a string resource. So here I'm using that string, r string, toast add to cart, and then I need to specify a length for the snack bar to appear, just like with the toast. You have a length short and a length long. But you'll notice that it is snackbar.length short instead of toast.length short. Everybody with me there?
Yeah, with toast, I know built in the IntelliSense, if you type toast with a capital T and tab over, it'll automatically do a short toast for you. It'll fill it in. Does this do that too? I don't have any.
I'm not sure. I don't usually use that shortcut, so I don't know. It might. I'm not sure. It is worth noting that this first argument with a toast is a context, whereas with a snack bar it is a view. So there is a little bit of difference there. And then finally you call show to make it appear. This part here where I'm saying set anchor view, that is optional. If I don't specify an anchor view, then that toast will appear at the bottom of the screen. So if I leave that out, you can see add to cart appears down here, kind of covering some of the buttons and controls. So I'm using that set anchor view to tell it that it should appear relative to the divider. So that's how you position it, is you provide an anchor view. Cool.
Okay, where the cart divider is, where is that in the XML?
In the XML, okay, let me go over to
it's like an editable text view, if you will. Yeah.
It's actually just a view. Here, let me see. There it is. It's just a view. You see how it's just view tag?
Yeah, I'm looking for what it's anchored to.
It's anchored basically between these things. I think it's anchored to the top of subtotal, if I remember right. So you can see the bottom edge of it is constrained to the top edge of the subtotal.
Okay, and it's 8dp, so the message doesn't go through the line. That's there.
Yeah, so it's 8D. This is it's got an 8dp margin between this view and the subtotal, so it's not right up next to it. The height of it is 4, and the reason it looks like a divider is just that I've set the background color. Like that's the thing that makes it look like a divider, is just setting the background color and setting the height. So that's all you need to do for a divider, is you just use a regular view, base class view, with the background. So that's why I'm anchoring it to. And so you can see that there, when we add it to cart, I show a snack bar. When the quantity is updated, I show a snack bar. When there's another one in here. Yeah. When we purchase something, then it comes back here and it'll show a snack bar there as well. If I look at the order activity, basically what I'm doing is when you press the button, I go through each of the things and say, well, if the name edit is blank, then let's say please enter name. Address is please enter name. So I'm just using a bunch of snack bars there. I'm not setting the anchor view, so it's just going to appear.
How long will I get connected to Wi-Fi?
It's just going to appear at the bottom of the screen.
Why do they call it snack bar? I'm trying to figure that out. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with a snack bar.
I have no idea. I'm sure it's somehow linked into previous versions being like based on candy. So maybe it's somehow connected to that. The candy bars, Kit Kat, and etc. I'm not really sure why they call it a snack bar, but that's what it is. So let's take a break here. Call it a 20-minute break. We'll come back at 2:10, and we'll finish up here talking about transitions. Okay, let's get this show back on the road. Just to check, is everybody back from break?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So last thing we want to talk about here, or last two things, we're going to quickly talk about how to implement transitions, as well as the swipe to refresh functionality. So in terms of transitions, these occur when you're switching screens. So for instance here, if I click on the donut, you'll see all the animations that are happening there, where things kind of go to the left or the right, and things slide from the item I clicked on to the next screen. Okay, so there's actually two different transitions happening here. The first one, where it's going left and right, that's just your regular transition. And the part where things slide from, say, the image coming bigger or smaller like that, is what we call a shared element transition, because the same element exists on multiple screens. So both of those are occurring there. So let's talk first about just the regular transitions that you can use when you're changing from one screen to another. The way these are set up or configured is you go into your theme, and you need to set two properties: the window enter transition and the window exit transition. Okay, so that changes what transition happens when you go from one screen to another. If I take these two lines out, where I'm setting the enter and the exit, we'll go back to the default transitions that we have here, still with the shared element transition. So with that, you can see the default is sort of a fade, where it fades from one thing to another. So that's the default behavior that we get there. What I had changed these to is I had changed both of these to what you can see here: Android transition slide right. So the Android part there, remember, that means it's a resource that's actually built into Android itself. I'm not defining this transition in my code. I'm just using a transition that is previously defined. It is possible to declare your own transitions in XML. I'm not going to talk here about how to do that, because realistically, I find that it's usually better to just use one of the transitions that they've already made most of the time. So you've got a transition, and I've set it to slide right. I could also, for instance, set this to explode on both sides. So explode on the exit and the enter. And so if I set it to explode, it kind of starts small and gets big. So click here and kind of see it exploding or becoming big there. If I hit back, it kind of comes back together. So it's worth noting that you want to use the same transition for the exit that you have for the enter, because it automatically, when you exit, it plays the transition in reverse. So you, like, if you're doing a slide left, you don't do a left and right. You just do left and left or right and right, because it will do the reverse of whatever transition that you give it in the other direction. So I could say slide right on both of those sides. And so when I click in here, you can see the elements slide to the right. When I leave, it slides back to the left. And vice versa, if I say slide left, we're going to see that it's reversed in both cases. So I click in here, it's going to slide in from the left and slide back out to the left. Any questions on that?
When you type that in there,
Yep.
on line 19 or 20, does it
Yep.
prompt you for the transition? No, it does not. You'd have to know what
it doesn't give me much of a suggestion. If I put in the first letter, then it starts giving me a position. So if I know that it starts with S, then it will give me like slide. I could do slide bottom on both of these, and it would slide in from the bottom.
Okay. You can just go to the docs and window enter transition. That's fixed, right? That's not.
Yeah, it has to be that. It has to be Android : window enter transition, Android : window exit transition. It's always going to be one of those two. It's worth noting because this is a theme and we have two different variations of that. I'm going to get undo the change that I have here to get back to my transition. It's worth noting because we have two different variants of the themes file, I do actually have to set this transition both here in the day version as well as the night version as well. Both of those you have to set the transition to get this to work. Okay? So that's how you set just the default transition that you're going to use going from one screen to another. So that has a pretty big impact. Just setting those two things can make your app look a whole lot better just with that. If you want to have that transition be different from screen to screen to screen, unfortunately that's not as easy because you end up having to really do this on you end up having to create multiple themes, like one theme for screens where it should be an explode or screens where it should be a slide from right. So you actually end up having to create several theme kind of subclasses. If you're going to do different transitions throughout the app, it's not easy to set up. But that's how you change it globally. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is how do we get these shared element transitions, which is where you kind of see the elements go from here, go to the next screen. The first thing you have to set up is you actually have to go into the layout. So for instance here, we're seeing the list of products. So under item product, you have to add a particular attribute. So on the image view, you can see that I'm saying transition name is image. Okay, so transition name is image, transition name for the name is name, transition name is description, transition name is price. So I'm setting the transition name property for each of these elements. That's needed in order to make these transitions work. Okay, that's step one, is giving each of these elements a name. Okay, and it's worth noting that this name, I'm not prefixing it with anything else because like I'm not prefixing it with the name of the screen, item product name, because I actually need this name, this transition name, to be the same on multiple screens. So for instance, in item product, I've set that up, and when you click there, you go over to the product detail screen. So also in this layout, in the product detail layout, you'll notice I have transition name image, transition name, etc. I have the exact same properties as I had in my my item layout. Everybody following with me there? So I'm just giving it the same transition name on both sides. Okay, so that's step one. You have to set that up to actually write the rest of the code. That out of the box does not make the transition happen, but it's necessary to enable you to make the transition. So the next thing you want to do, let me go into my adapter. So this is the product list adapter. So previously, when I clicked on the item, I just would say, let's make an intent. I'll put the product ID in there, and then we'll start the activity, right? That's the normal thing. In order to make a shared element transition work, you have to add this additional object, this activity options object. So the idiom here that you need to know, you say activity options is equal to activity options.make scene transition animation. So this creates the necessary scene transition thing in order to make any of these transitions happen. If you don't have one of these options objects, then you're not going to change from the default animations. So we make that. We need to provide it a context as the first argument, and that's the only required argument. The only thing you have to pass is a context. From there, what we need to pass is what is a bunch of pairs, okay? And these pairs are specifically a pair of view and a name. View and the name. So here I'm saying pair create, and so I'm creating the image. I'm taking the image from the view holder and pairing that with the name of the shared element. So remember, I put those into my layouts. I put image, I put name, I put description, I put price. So it's going to match it up on the next screen by these names here. So it's going to look over on the next screen. It's like, okay, is there something called image? Is there something called name? Is there something called description? Something called price? And it's going to use that as the target for where it animates to. So because I've got the image here, and I've said animate the image to where the image is, that's how that operates. So it's by creating this object here, and then what you do when you call start activity, you provide it as another argument to start activity. So I pass the intent plus this, the options dot to bundle. So that's how you get it to actually show the transition. Any questions there?
To bundle, that's similar to the change, the state change, right? Where the orientation, that's the same concept there.
It's a bundle, yeah. So it's taking the options object here and converting it to a bundle. But we don't use that bundle directly. We just pass it. You don't want to manipulate that bundle. You just pass it the start activity.
It just does its magic.
Yeah, it just does its magic. We create the options and we work with the options, and then we'll just say to bundle and let it go from there. So you don't actually need to worry about the bundle object in here. You just say convert it to a bundle, and because the hard work is done with this part. It's worth noting, even on those screens, that I'm not doing a shared element transition. So for instance, when I'm going from here, going to place order, to get it to do that slide transition like I wanted it to, I still had to pass an options object. So for instance, if I go into card activity and look at on place order, I'm still making an options object. I'm just not providing it any pairs. I'm still saying make scene transition animation, and then I'm passing that into start activity for result. Again, options.toBundle. So basically, you end up putting these scene transition anytime you're putting in an intent. Anytime you're starting a new activity, you put that option in to get it to show the proper animation. Cool. So that is all the code that's needed to make the transitions happen. The rest of it happens just basically automatically. Any questions on the transitions? Does that make sense?
Yeah, mostly makes sense. It's my big worry is how would I come up with this on my own? How would I get this? I can look it up, but I would try it. It doesn't work. Anyway, just thoughts on it. I see this. I can walk through the video and memorize it, but it's very forgettable.
So I just sent the link in Discord. Here's the article where you'll find this information. Start an activity using an animation. So that's the article that Google provides about this. You can read that to get some more info on it. I will say that not all of this information is correct or up to date. But this is their own documentation on how to do it. Okay?
Okay.
It is, however, been embedded in the middle of a very long sequence called this animations and transitions. It's like chapter 9-ish. So it can be a little bit hard to read simply by the fact that it is so far into there. It's expecting that you know some of the previous things. But so that's why I'm focusing on just the little bit of code that you actually need, as to compare to all the code that is possible. Cool. So the next short topic is swipe to refresh. So oftentimes you'll have screens where you're showing some sort of dynamic data, some data that's pulled from an external source, and you may need to refresh it. So the way that we kind of do that in Android is we have this pull down. You can swipe down, you see that sort of circular icon pop up, and then when you release it, it updates the data. So that's how you initiate it. I've hooked this up on the example app. It's on the main screen, main activity. I can pull down to refresh, and then you'll see as soon as that finishes, it's also showing a snack bar. So that's where that fits in. That will be more important going forward in the next few chapters when we start talking about how to get data from the internet into your applications. So that's what we're talking about briefly here, is how to implement that. Anytime you have that swipe to refresh functionality, it is strongly recommended from an accessibility standpoint that you also put a menu icon to do the same thing. So for here, I can swipe down to refresh, but I could also just press this button on the menu. That's because a lot of users don't necessarily know may not know that gesture exists. So if the only way to do it is through the gesture, that can be a problem in terms of accessibility. So let's talk about the code necessary to do that, which is really not a lot. The first thing you have to do is, let me go into activity main. What you have to do is put your recycler view, you have to wrap this swipe refresh layout around it. So my recycler view is inside of a swipe refresh layout. That's all I need to change in terms of that's my change in terms of the layout to make that happen. You'll also notice that I've given an ID to both of these, the product list refresh and product list, because I do need to be able to reference both of those controls in code to then respond to when the user initiates that gesture. So we're going to say, wrap that around, right? So we've got a recycler view that's inside of a swipe refresh layout. And so that enables that functionality.
Can that be used with the cards that we were doing before?
What do you mean with cards?
Not sure if I'm asking a smart question here, but I remember when we started out, right, we had the cards.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about today?
I guess there's nothing to refresh, so you wouldn't want to do it anyway.
Yeah, I could potentially do that on the shopping cart screen. I could have a swipe to refresh in here as well, but there really is no reason for it, because this is all basically on your device. It shouldn't be out of sync. You shouldn't let it get out of sync. Whereas if you're talking about a screen like this, well, let's say, for instance, you're talking about your social media page. I might need to refresh and see if somebody else, one of my friends, has posted something new, or if there's a new news article or things like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
A lot of times this may update from something else. So that's where this fits in. It's worth noting, if you just try to directly put in the swipe refresh layout, it will not work. You'll get a red error, some red text in here, because it'll say, I can't find swipe refresh layout. So to use swipe refresh layout, you do actually need to bring in a dependency. And so that dependency is here, swipe refresh layout So this is swipe refresh layout 1.10 is the newest version of this. So you do have to add that to your Gradle and sync it in order to be able to use this component. So usually that's what you'll want to maybe do first is add that in here, and then go add in the swipe refresh layout in your layout in here. From what I remember, this swipe refresh layout I don't think appears in the designer. So like if I look for it here, look for swipe, nothing comes up. So the only way to add that component is through the code. You can't do it through the designer. Again, you can kind of read up on this at the article I'll link here. That's where the full documentation on this is. So set up the swipe refresh layout, bring in the Gradle dependency, and then it's just a matter of handling the event. So if I go back to main activity, I'm saying let's find view by ID. I'll go find that product list refresh that comes up back as a swipe refresh layout. And then I just need to hook up a listener. So I say refresh layout.set on refresh listener. And so I give it a listener. And so when it's refreshed, I'm just calling here my refresh method. So I say, okay, well, when that happens, we'll call down to refresh, and there's the actual logic that it runs. The reason that I have it as a separate method here is that way I can call it from the menu as well as that swipe to refresh action as well, the gesture as well. Interesting things to note. One of the things you need to remember to do, you may need to, if this is a long-running process, you may need to remember to set the refreshing to true, and that keeps the animation up, or turns the animation on if it's not. It's also worth noting that you need to eventually turn it off. So if I don't call set refreshing in here, what will happen is I pull this down, and it'll just continue spinning there. So because the gesture initiates that icon appearing, you actually have to tell it to go away. So I have to say, well, let's set refreshing to false, and when we've done the update, and that's what actually makes it go away. Otherwise, it does not go away on its own. That's really all there is to know about that swipe to refresh component. Any questions? Quick run through of a smattering of the small things today.
No, definitely going to need the video to code it up, though.
Okay. You'll have the code example as well. So, all right. So that's what I have for you today, and you guys can get, continue on with the labs. I think that's like the last page in the in your worksheet. Remember that these are due by the end of the week. The lesson 5 labs are due by the end of the week, and we have your next hands-on test on Monday.
End of the week meaning Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday.
Okay.
And so we'll have the next hands-on test on Monday. So